Japan. As you go to work, you have to step over the sleeping bodies of people who have passed out in the street. These are not homeless people. These are Japanese businessmen, professional, white-collar workers, still in their suits with their briefcases, who never made it home the night before because they were too drunk. The Japanese are probably the hardest working people in the world, but these businessmen like to entertain their clients with parties and going to clubs and drinking way too much alcohol. So every evening when it gets late, they just pass out wherever they happen to be. There are a few women, but it's mostly men. And we're talking about thousands of them all over the cities. Tokyo's a big city. And they end up everywhere. There are bus stops, stairways, subways, on the street, just wherever they land. And it got so bad that a chain of nightclubs started a media campaign to try to stop it. And how it works is they go out and they find a passed out businessman, and they take some duct tape, and they make a square around the body, sleeping body. And then they take a copy of their logo, and they make a frame. And they take a copy of their logo and they put it in the frame. And their logo is the word nomesugi, which means too drunk. Then they take a picture of the sleeping person and post it onto their website. Then they encourage other people passing by to also take pictures of the sleeping person and post it to Snapchat, Instagram, whatever their website is. They create a billboard of the behavior that they're trying to stop and spread it all over the city. This campaign uses public shaming to influence people's behavior. And it works. Why? Because these businessmen do not want to look bad to their family, to their friends, their co-workers, their boss, and their children. And I thought, gosh, I wonder what would happen if you tried that in Austin, Texas. Say, just go down to 6th Street, find some passed out people, and try to shame them by putting their pictures online. But then I said, wait a minute, we've already got that. It's called Facebook. Facebook, what do you see? What go up there? That's what Facebook is. People behaving badly, right? Lots of pictures. And as far as I can tell, it has absolutely no effect at all on the level of public drinking. So, is there no shame in Austin, Texas? But we know that public shaming still works. A few weeks ago, nominations for the Academy Awards came out, remember? And for the 2nd year in a row, no people of color on the main list there. And a lot of people were upset by the situation and called out the Academy, and there was criticism, and there was threats of boycott, and there was just general unhappiness. Within 7 days, the Academy announced drastic changes to its membership and its voting to increase diversity. Changes that it had resisted for decades. Right? The cover of Variety magazine that week had a white Oscar on a white background with the words over it, "Shame on us." Shame works. It works so well that just the fear of being shamed will make people change their behavior. My wife and I were sitting in front of the TV screen the other night, and I saw an ad for what I think probably might be the worst movie ever contemplated of being made, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. Right? Pride and Prejudice, that old Jane Austen novel, 18th century English people, kind of a comedy of manners and social climbing and stuff like that, with about 200 zombies thrown in. So you have people in these costumes running around, slashing up and chopping up all these zombies. And I looked over at my wife and I said, I would be ashamed to be seen in a movie like that. Now, I didn't say I didn't want to see it. What I said was, I don't want anybody else to see me while I'm seeing it. Right? Not the same thing. Right? Besides, I can wait till it comes out on cable anyway, probably next week. That's how effective shame is, right? Even if no one else knows what I'm doing, I'm still afraid they might find out. And I would be ashamed. Shame is so potent, so powerful in our lives that most of the time society doesn't even have to enforce it. We enforce it on ourselves. Certainly our text today is a prime example of that. It comes from a time very early in the ministry of Jesus. He's just announced his ministry in his hometown, and the folks were so overcome and overwhelmed that they ran him out of town on a rail. Now he's moved to Capernaum, right, about 40 miles away. Much bigger town, next to a lake, where the primary industry is fishing, right? Luke calls the lake Gennesaret, which is derived from the Hebrew word for harp. And the reason for that is because the lake is shaped like a harp. It's kind of flat on one side and curved on the other side, so it looks like a harp. So, Harp Lake. And this is a big lake. It's about 13 miles long, 9 miles across. And I always wondered what kind of fish they caught out of this lake, because the Bible's always talking about fish this and fish that. Turns out that it's a fish you're already aware of, something you already eat. It's tilapia, right? You go to the lake, most of the fish in the Sea of Galilee, Lake of Gennesaret, are tilapia, right? Which the locals still call St. Peter's fish. And what you probably don't know, and this being a Black History Month, is that the word tilapia is an African word that comes from the Tswana people in Southwest Africa. It's their word for fish. So every time you order your tilapia somewhere, you're using an African word. So you learned something in church today. The text says that Jesus is teaching people by the lake. And, you know, he's up against the water, and they're all crowding around him, and no one can hear. So, but he's got an idea. He sees two boats. He gets into one of the boats and pushes the boat out about 10 or 20 feet from the water. You know how sound travels over the water real well. You know, you can be a long way away. So this worked for him. He pulled out a little bit and sat down in the boat, and everybody was able to hear what he was doing. And when he's finished, he turns around to Peter and says, okay, I want you to push out into the deep water and drop down your nets because we're going to go fishing. And Peter looks at Jesus like he was crazy. I said, you know, look, we've been fishing all night. We've been up and down this lake. We've done everything we know how to do, and we haven't caught a thing. But if you say so, we'll go ahead and do it. Now, what you've got to remember about all this is that this is not subsistence fishing. This is not a guy on the end of a pier with a bucket and no, this is fishing for money. This is a business. The brothers, James and John, are his partners. They go out and they get fish, and they sell the fish for money, and that's how they feed their family. So if there's no fish, there's no money. Now, you know how fishing is. There might be a million reasons why you didn't catch fish that day, but the bottom line is no fish, no money, no food for your family. Now, when your self-worth is tied to what you produce, right, and you come home with nothing, right, your self-worth takes a beating. You've let your family down. You've let your co-workers down. You've let your boss down. You're not just a bad fisherman, you're a bad father. You're a bad son. And you feel shame. And Peter is ashamed, standing there cleaning his empty net in front of everybody. And now, this man is shaming him even more by asking him to go back out there and fish some more. Now, there's debate as to whether men or women feel more shame. Years ago, most people thought, well, it's got to be women to feel the most shame because they recognize that we have all these systemic things that traditionally have worked against women. Economic discrimination, political, social discrimination. And one of those people who believed that was a scholar, a very popular writer named Brené Brown. She works right down the street at the University of Houston. And when she first started to study shame, she decided to only study women because she thought, well, it's just logical. They have the most shame. And she came from a strong feminist background, and it made sense that women suffered shame from the media, shame about their bodies, the sexualization of women. Until one day, she was at a book signing for one of her books, and she signed 4 copies of a book. There was a man and a woman, and she signed 4 copies of her book and gave them to the woman. And the woman turns around and says, come on, honey. And the husband says, no, I want to stay here and talk to her. And the wife was stay pulling at him, say, come on, let's go, let's go. And the man saying, no, I'm going to talk to her. And they started to get a little tense between them. And he's kind of hunkering down like this. And the woman finally goes away. And the man turns to her and says, look, I really like everything you said. I like this idea of reaching out and telling our stories and showing up, but you didn't mention men. And she looked at him and she said, I don't study men. And he said, well, that's convenient. And her heart sort of sunk a little bit, and she didn't know what to say. And he said, because we have shame. We have very deep shame. But when we reach out to tell our stories, we get the emotional stuffing beat out of us. He said, before you say anything about all those mean fathers and those coaches and those brothers and those bully friends, my wife and my 3 daughters, the ones you just signed the books for, they had rather see me die on top of my horse than watch me fall off. And he turned and walked away. And she knew he was right. She realized that men experience deep shame, and that even she was inculcated with this idea that a man cannot show any kind of weakness, especially to the people who are closest to him. This man could never go home and tell his wife or his children about his deepest fears and his feelings because he thought they would think he was weak. Men do feel shame. She writes in her book that the number one trigger for shame in women is body image. And the number one trigger for shame in men is the appearance of weakness. And this is Peter's situation. He has been exposed as a bad fisherman, a bad provider, bad business person. And suddenly the nets are full of fish, like they came out of nowhere. And so many that they have to get the other boat to come over and help them struggle back to the shore. And the people on the shore are watching all this happen. They know what's going on. Of all the things that Jesus could have done, he does the one thing that truly gets to Peter. More than anyone else, Peter knew there were no fish out there. They'd been fishing all night long, tried everything they knew how to do. There are no fish in that lake today. And now Jesus does the one thing that makes Peter, above everyone else, feel ashamed. People with poor self-image are prone to shame, right? Now, you would think Christians of all people would have a better attitude of themselves when it comes to shame. I was once in Dallas at E.K. Bailey's preaching conference, and I sat in on a class with a wonderful man named Howard Hendricks, written many books, professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, and a Baptist institution, by the way. And he had what he thought was the best job in the whole seminary. It was his job to train the missionaries. Right? At the end of their education, they all came, just before they were released on the world. They would come in and he would have a class with just missionary students. Now, if you're a Baptist, a missionary is sort of like a living saint. You know, these are the best of the best. These are God's Marines, right? There's the most upright, squeaky clean, right, people you can find. And we're going to send them to the most godless, far off, dangerous, desolate places on the planet. You know, all the places you and I don't want to go. You know, China, Africa, East Rundberg Lane, places like that, you know. And it was his job to get them ready for this. So he did a little experiment. Each year, first day of class, he would hand out blank 3x5 cards. And they would all be sitting there and he would tell them, okay, I want you to take the first card and I want you to write down all of your positive qualities on the card. Dead silence in the class. People just kind of looking around, scratching their heads and, you know, just not talking, nothing going on there. And after a few uncomfortable minutes of this, he would say, okay, put it down. Okay, now pick up the other card. Okay, now I want you to write down all of your negative qualities. And they went crazy, right? They wrote all over those cards, right? They had more negative qualities than they knew what to do with. One came up and asked him for another card because he ran out of room on his card. And I thought, wait a minute, these are the people we're going to send out to start churches, to convert people, to spread the good news. But when they look at themselves, all they seem to see is their faults, their imperfections, their failures. That kind of person is prone to shame. And I thought, what kind of churches are these people going to start? Will the people in the church be like them? People who have this negative image of themselves? People who are easily controlled by shame? Because the church has used shame to control people for hundreds of years. Why? Because it works. Right? Peter was shamed 3 different times. First, the all-night epic fish failure. Right? Second, having to go back out to the scene of the crime, out on the lake. But the third was the absolute worst. You see, Peter had been sitting there cleaning his nets while Jesus was preaching and teaching to all the other people. He had heard everything that Jesus had said. And now the proof of everything that Jesus said was sitting in his net. The confirmation of God's work was swimming right in his face, and he could not ignore it. But instead of joy at the realization, Peter falls to his knees and said, "Oh no, go away from me because I'm a sinful man." Peter is saying to Jesus, "Look, I'm not just a bad fisherman, I'm a bad person. Go away. I'm not worthy of your love. I don't deserve your help. Leave me alone so I can get back to sinning, please." The shame of it all has driven him literally to his knees. Now it's strange in my thinking, so many times in scriptures what you see is that when someone encounters God, their first reaction isn't, "Oh joy," it's, "Oh no." Right? Not happiness, but dread. In our Old Testament reading for today, right? Isaiah sees the Lord high and lifted up, right? And the smoke was filling the temple. Now, remember, Isaiah is a guy who's been around. He's worked in the court for a long time. He's seen kings and queens and princes come and go. He's seen all the pomp and splendor, but he's never seen the fiery seraphim and the temple filled with smoke and the angels crying out, "Holy, holy, holy," and the ground was shaking. Instead of cheering, he says, "Woe is me, because I'm a foul-mouthed man." Mary is visited by an angel who tells her, "Look, great deal, you're going to give birth to the Prince of Peace, the Alpha, Omega, King of Kings, and the Lord of Lords." And his reaction is, "No, I don't think so." Not interested. Psychologists talk about the difference between false shame and real shame. False shame is what the advertisers use to get you to feel guilty about not buying their soap. Right? It's false shame. It's something they manufacture to put on you. Real shame comes from the realization that who you really are doesn't match who you think you are. And when Jesus reveals who he truly is, he also reveals us for what we truly are. And when we see the difference between the two, then we're ashamed. But it doesn't stop there. Right? Shame is not a destination. Shame is something that happens to you on your way to your destination. God does not mean for you or any of God's children to live in perpetual shame. So many times you've seen Christians who seem they got stuck at that point of confession and could never go any further. They just keep confessing and confessing and confessing and confessing. Confession of sin is not the end. Redeeming grace is, right? Peter thought his whole life was about how many fish he caught that day. That was his reason for being. And then Christ showed him how it was God all along. It was God who controlled the fish. It was God who had provided for him all that time. It was God who had rescued him when he was in trouble, time and time again. A God who continued to love him when he was unlovable. And what God wanted to show him that day had nothing to do with fish. His job wasn't over, it was just starting. Jesus gave Peter grace that released him from his shame and gave a new direction to his life. Didn't make him perfect. Didn't take away all of his problems. It gave him a new purpose for living. Sometimes God has to take away what we think we need in order to show us how much we need God. Has that ever happened to you?
Yes.
Yes. If not, no, show of hands. Yes. If it hasn't, it will. Right? Sooner or later, whatever you depend on to keep from depending on God will fail. Right? There are some things in life we depend on for our existence. Something that has to be there for us to be us. Right? Our job, our money, our looks, our health. Sooner or later, whatever you depend on is going to fail. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote a play in which one character tells another character, says, I killed God. And the other character asks him, why did you do that? And he says, because he knew too much. Beautiful. Yeah, he knew too much. God knows too much about you and me. You remember that thing that happened to you that time? God knows. That time you almost got in really big trouble? God knows. That thing that no one else but you knows, not even your best friend knows? God knows. God knows. Let's conduct a little experiment, you and me, like Brother Hendricks back in the first page. I want you to close your eyes for just a second. I'll close mine. And I want you to think of that one thing about which you feel the most shame. Don't say it. Don't raise your hand. Just think about it. Now, it wasn't too hard to find, was it? It was right there. How incredible that just remembering that shame starts to bring back all of those feelings. Now think about this. God already knows what you're ashamed of. He's known it for a long, long time, and He has already forgiven you for it. Now, if God has already forgiven you, is there any reason you should still feel ashamed? You can open your eyes now. I'm afraid some of you were drifting on. God knows, and God has already forgiven you. You see, what is it? God has forgiven us. The problem is that we haven't forgiven ourselves. Right? Who are you to put your feelings of shame above God's forgiveness? I mean, every Sunday, just before passing the peace, somebody stands right here and tells all of you, in Jesus Christ you are forgiven. But does it penetrate to where we are? Or is it true that we would rather hold on to shame than release it and grab on to God's forgiveness? Have we become so used to living a life of shame that we cannot imagine living any other way? But how can we if God knows? Mark Twain wrote that human beings are the only animal that blushes, or needs to. Right? Twain recognized animals act on instinct and cannot feel shame, but human beings act on fear, on guilt, on anger, and they do feel shame. All of us are Peter, trying to look good, but not feeling good, trying to stay on top, but knowing we're not really in charge of anything. Always trying to feel superior, but always knowing that our sins are right in front of us. And when it all gets taken away, and the only thing left to us is just a face, let it be the face of the one who loves us, who says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Oh, by the way, all those people who shamed you, God forgave them too. Why? I mean, I can see God forgiving my shame. But why does God want to forgive the shame of all those people who shamed me? Right? Because God created a community of people to fish, to love, to forgive, to give grace, to give the world what the world can't give to itself. The shame of it all is that we are forgiven. Right? The shame of it all is that it came at a price. The shame of it all is that the one without sin took on the sin and shame of the world, beaten and despised, mocked and abandoned. Our shame became his shame. God knows. God knows all about our shame, our sin, about us. He knew we would need a Savior. Someone who would take away the sin and the shame and replace it with love. See, with shame, it's not a question of whether God will redeem it, but whether we will release it. Grace is free, but forgiveness costs you something. It'll cost us our self-righteousness, our arrogance, and our excuses. It cost God the most precious thing God had, his child. The shame of it all is now that God has finally provided a way out of our shame that we might not take. We have a song that we're going to do now. It's going to be something a little unusual, but I think it speaks to the situation. I think this is the kind of song that Peter might sing if he was here.
In dark hours of confrontation,